reality. We're in an election year. So there's going to be nothing of anything significant that happens between now and November. The president and, quite frankly, most of the Congress is already in campaign mode. And as a result of campaign mode, things just kind of slow down. Now, there may be some possibility that we will have a couple things happen. For example, there may be a transportation bill that gets passed through the Congress. And there may be a farm bill, which expires this year as well, that gets passed through the Congress. Beyond that, I don't see much hope of anything beyond that happening, quite frankly. You will see no major tax reform happening between now and the fall. You may see some ideas floated out, some proposals that are maybe put in place that people have a chance to kind of weigh in on, but there's going to be no major tax reform. The two sides are pretty far apart on things. You will hear the left, for example, say we need to raise tax rates on the rich. You will hear the right say maybe we ought to be looking at reforming our tax code, removing loopholes in tax expenditures and using the savings to lower the rates. And I will just say one thing for those of you, because I get asked the question a lot, don't you think we should tax the rich more? And I will say, if you want to tax the rich more, then you leave the current code that we have in place. Do it. Because the current code already does it very, very effectively. The top 1% paying 37% of the income tax. Top 10% is paying about 70% of the income tax. The bottom 50% is paying about 2% of the tax. And so the current tax code is a very effective, progressive tax code that really does get at the rich quite effectively. So I will tell you, though, that the very, very rich, the millionaires and billionaires, you often hear, let's put a surtax on it, adding a percent or two on that income level won't change anything other than you'll encourage them to move their money to other types of shelters, and there'll be nothing that will be gained other than, well, you know, some people feel good because we got after those nasty successful people, and it will not result in a single additional dollar going into the tax coffers. And I would also say this, that it's been my observation that a lot of the very nice things that we have here in Green Bay and after throughout the district have been in very large way been provided for the citizens in Appleton and Green Bay because of very affluent Americans that live in Appleton and Green Bay and have made their wealth in Appleton and Green Bay. Fox City's Performing Arts Center is an example. The St. Elizabeth Heart Center is an example. St. Elizabeth Hospital. You go over to St. Mary's Hospital and other places where affluent citizens here in Green Bay and Appleton have given of their wealth. And the idea that what we should do instead is send that wealth to Washington, where they're going to send it to Oklahoma, makes no sense to me. What we ought to do is be encouraging that philanthropy right here in our own district, letting them choose to do with their money as they will, and accept the fact that they've been very generous, and maybe just say thank you. And so that's kind of where things are at. There have been some tax ideas floated out there, and these are kind of what I call trial balloons that members put out. One is to reduce almost all tax expenditures or tax deductions in the corporate world and take it and drop the rate. This was something that President Obama suggested in his State of the Union address twice now that I've heard. And said, let's go ahead and lower that rate so that American businesses are more competitive abroad. However, if we just lower the rate to where the international competition is, what we're at best doing is fighting for a tie. And we ought to be going to, if we're going to compete with England or Europe or China, Asia, if we're going to compete with them, let's compete to win. You know, and we need to understand the dynamics of corporate tax law. Only about 8% of income to the federal treasury comes from the corporate taxes anyway. So lowering the rate to be more competitive to grow the economy will actually bring more revenue in. But if we just lower deductions and then take the savings and lower the rate to the even place where corporations were paying anyway, we've done nothing to actively change the dynamics globally. And so we actually, if we're going to take that approach, then what we ought to be doing is maybe throwing out the tax code in its entirety and kind of starting over with a fairer, flatter, broader tax code. And so I think that's probably the prevailing wisdom in the House of Representatives. The Senate has no prevailing wisdom whatsoever, and so they will do whatever they're going to do, which has been very little. So you're going to see hardly anything happening out of the U.S. Senate. There are 23 Democrats and 10 Republicans up for election. 1/3 of their body gets elected every 2 years, and they're in full-blown defense right now. And so I wouldn't anticipate hardly any action at all coming from the United States Senate. We're going to have to wait now for the American people to make a choice. In the last election, they made a choice, and they basically turned over one branch of government to conservatives. In the fall, they will make another choice, and they will either give it back to liberals, progressives, or they'll give another branch to conservatives. They may give us split government. They may give us a centralized government that has one party controlling all levers. Quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, that is up to you. We'll do the best we can to hold our seat, but the American people back in 1776 cast off a sovereign king, and our citizens replaced that sovereign king with a sovereign people, and that would be you all. And so what the American people collectively choose through the election process will determine what happens in the next several years. And so if you're inclined to believe that the Affordable Health Care Act is going to cost $1.7 trillion like the CEO just said it would, if you want that repealed, you're going to have, the only way you can get it repealed is to give conservatives all three levers. If you didn't like the reforms in Dodd-Frank, for example, you want that fixed, well, you've got the same issue. And so it's totally up to you. What you decide is going to be what happens. That's the wonderful thing about our government. We sometimes don't like what government does, but that's because we often deny the power that as individual Americans you each have in the voting booth and in your communities and in the discussions you have in groups like this. These discussions matter because sovereign American people are making decisions each and every day for what they would like their government to look like. And quite frankly, the American people are conflicted themselves because you have folks way on the far left and folks way on the far right and virtually everywhere in between. And probably the thing that I've learned the most is that, and as many of you know, I've never served any public capacity before, so I have some learning to do. But I look at a piece of legislation kind of on a continuum, like a teeter-totter. And often, because legislation is never perfect, there are things that are bad in that legislation, and there are things that are good in that legislation. And I have to decide where the fulcrum point is. If the fulcrum point is over here, there's more good than bad, I'll vote yes for it. But if the fulcrum point moves over here and there's more bad than good, then I vote no for it. But every time I vote on an imperfect piece of legislation, even though I've decided to vote yes, I may be voting yes on some things that not everybody wants. And that's how our system of government works. I often say the only perfect piece of legislation one gets to vote on is the piece of legislation that they wrote. And but even then, it often goes through the committee process and doesn't look remotely like what you started with. But that's kind of the dynamic of what we have. And so to the degree that I choose wisely, I generally have part of the population that likes what I did and part of the population that doesn't. Because some, even if they're Republicans or conservatives like me, they will say, well, that bad, I had the fulcrum over here further. You know, and it does change, and so it's complex. It's not as straightforward and simple as we'd like it to be. But to the degree that I can come to meetings like this and hear what's on your mind and hear what your concerns are and try to address your questions, I'm happy to do so. And so with that, what I'd like to do is just kind of open the floor for your questions, and I'm happy to take those questions and answer them.
Reid, may I?
Yeah.
Because we invited you for lunch, can we suspend normal questions immediate? I want you to all get your questions together. We'll let the congressman enjoy at least part of your meal.
Yes.
Is that all right for everyone? Okay.
All right.
By the way,
Neil will be back.
I just